This happened about 30 years ago in a small town about 10 minutes outside of Atlantic City. I was about 25 at the time, and my mom was in her mid-50s. It was a week or so before Christmas, and my mom asked if I wanted to go with her to a small shop so she could pick out a few things. I agreed and even offered to drive. We pulled into the parking lot and parked facing a stockade fence, the kind that were all the rage in the 80s and 90s. This was bordered by a small, barely 2-lane street on the side we entered on, and a 4-lane highway on the other side. The lot served a Chinese restaurant, a deli, a pizzeria, the shop we had stopped there for, and a few other businesses. It was around 6 p.m., so only the pizzeria, the restaurant, and the shop were open, so there were very few cars. The first 3 spots on either side were handicap spaces, so I parked further down in one of the 8 spots between the handicap spots. We get out of the car and had only gone a few steps towards the street when a man that I would guess was in his late 30s, early 40s, walked out from in between a couple cars. My spider sense went into full alert immediately. He took a couple steps towards us, looked right at us and said, "I fucking hate people like you." I instinctively took a step to my side to place myself between him and my mom. "Like what?" I said. "People that park in handicap spots," he said, nodding behind me. I had grown up in this town. I rode my bike here all the time as a kid and was here quite often as an adult. I for sure knew I wasn't in any of those spots. I had even parked a few spots further in, since neither me nor my mom had mobility issues. "I'm not in a handicap spot," I said confidently. This time the man pointed over my shoulder, grew agitated and said, "Yes, you are. Look." It was then I realized that he knew that we weren't parked in a handicap spot, but he was trying to get me to turn around. I don't know what his intentions were. I'm a pretty big guy, 6'1", 200 plus pounds. I'm not sure if he had a weapon or was just trying to distract me so he could get the jump, maybe snatch my mom's purse. Either way, I decided that rather than confront him directly, I'd play a little game back. I drove a Chrysler, and back then the keys were topped with a plastic pentagon with the Dodge logo stamped onto it. I curled my fist around the plastic head of the key with the middle part sticking out a couple inches between my pointer and middle finger, so that if one were to be punched in the eye, well, they wouldn't have an eye after that. I held my hand up and pointed over my shoulder with the middle part of the key and said, "There's no signs on that spot." His eyes flashed from behind me to the key protruding between my fingers, back to my eyes. I flashed my eyes to the key, lowered my hand slightly, then met his gaze. My mom was behind me saying something I don't recall. The game of chicken between me and this guy goes on for about 3 to 4 seconds. It felt like 5 minutes before he says, "Whatever, fuck you," and walks towards the highway at the opposite end of the parking lot. I watch him leave before turning around. Sure enough, there were at least 3 spots between my car and the handicap spot. He was 100% trying to distract me. He was so matter of fact as he walked towards the store. My mom was wondering what he was going on about. I told her that he was trying to get us to turn around. The second time, when he had pointed, my mom said she turned around, even though she knew we weren't parked in the handicap spot. I'm glad I trusted my instincts. It's not the first time my spider sense was right, but that's another story for another day. I'm a female. Back when I was in college in Texas, my roommates, 1 female and 2 males, and I decided to drive to Boulder, Colorado for spring break. To maximize our time at Boulder, we decided to take shifts and drive all the way through rather than stopping for overnight stays. It was roughly an 18-hour trip. So I'm driving my shift when we reached the Texas Panhandle in the early morning hours. We were in the middle of nowhere and had not seen a single car in either direction for ages when we noticed headlights behind us. The car came up on us so quickly, then followed behind for some time. Oddly, it would get real close, then back off real far, then get close again. This pattern continued for several miles. We were in the car nervously joking about it being a potential deliverance situation set in Texas flat land. Suddenly the headlights are joined by red and blue lights. It was so dark out there that we hadn't seen the light bar on the hood and had not realized that we were being followed by a cop. I checked my speedometer and I'm not speeding, so we are all wondering why we're getting pulled over. I go ahead and pull up on the shoulder. Up comes the cop wearing a cowboy hat to my window. He shines his light in the car and looks us over, then asks me to get out of the car. I hesitate at first, but there's 3 other people in the car, so I'm not feeling particularly unsafe at this point. I grab my wallet, get out, and stand against the driver's door. The cop looks at my license and insurance, then tells me that he's gonna do a sobriety test. I'm thinking, what the fuck? But I know I had nothing to drink, so I say okay. The cop directed me for the walking in a straight line test and had me ending my walk right by his car. When I finished, he reached over to his back passenger door and then opened it, told me to get in. What? Why? Sit in the car while I look at your license. Now, I had heard that the doors on the back of cop cars only open from the outside, so I know if I get into this car and he closes the door, I won't be able to get out. It's like 3 a.m. in the morning, pitch black darkness, on a road dozens of miles from any civilization. I'm not getting in that car. I'm sorry, with all respect, and for my own safety, I don't want to get in the back of your car. The cop angrily says to me, "What did you say to me?" Me repeating, "For my own safety, and with all respect, I'm not sitting in the back of your car. You can call for another officer to come out here, but I did not feel safe getting in your car." The cop angrily says, "Do you realize I could arrest you right now for not obeying an order from an officer?" Again, sir, I'm not meaning to be disrespectful, but I'm not getting into your car. We go back and forth like this for several minutes, him threatening to arrest me, my friends, hold us overnight, etc., and me refusing to get into his car. The cop then leers at me and asks, "What, are you afraid of being kidnapped?" What the fuck? How fucked up to even ask that. I glance towards my car and see my friends piled up at the back window, watching. The 2 guys looked ready to jump out. The cop turns to look at them too. I don't know what went through his mind, but after being completely aggressive with me for what seemed like forever, he finally gave me a creepy smile, handed back my license and insurance, tipped his hat, then got into his car and drove off. At this point, I was shaking so badly that my friends had to help me get back into the car. I didn't even remember if he gave me a ticket. I was so glad that I had not cried in front of that asshole, but I totally broke down once I was in the back seat. To this day, I think about that dickhead deciding to terrorize a young college female at 3 a.m. in the middle of rural Texas, and often wonder what could have happened to me if I had not stood my ground and instead gotten into his damn police car. I would like to preface this by saying I was 17 when this happened, and I was incredibly dumb, mentally ill, and addicted to drugs. I am 26 now, and am well aware of how dangerous of a situation I had put myself in. With that being said, let's begin. I was out with my friends on campus drinking and smoking all night. I separated from them at some point and ran out of cigarettes. I was doing uppers all night and really needed them. I went to school right outside of Yonkers in the Bronx, so it was not the safest area in the world by any means, but I didn't care, so I just walked down to the nearest bodega to get some cigarettes. The cashier wouldn't sell me any because I was underage and didn't have my ID. There was one other man at the bodega, a 65-year-old plus, scraggly looking man, who overheard our transaction and began to defend me to the cashier, saying things like, "Come on man, she just wants some cigarettes." The cashier wouldn't sell them to me and wouldn't let the other customer buy them for me. So this man, let's call him Carl, told me that he had some cigarettes at his house, which was only a minute away. Like I said before, I really wanted a cigarette, so I hopped in his beat up truck and he starts asking me why I'm out so late. And my intelligent self told him that I was partying all night and was currently on a bunch of coke. He started telling me about himself. He said that he was picking up some old appliances and selling the scrap metal for money, and asked if I wanted to help him. I thought, why not? This will be a funny and random story. So I said yes. We go around a few different neighborhoods and houses, picking up some air conditioners and heaters. I remember that I got a cut from the metal at some point and was bleeding a little bit, but not seriously. So we do that for about an hour, and he's like, "Oh right, your cigarettes," and says that we're gonna stop at his house. We pull up, he opens the door, and I barely walk inside because this is obviously weird. Plus there are about 10 other guys in there, mostly younger, like 25 to 30, who were all looking at me kinda weird. They were being nice but looked a bit confused and didn't talk much. Carl said he just had to get something, but all he did was pace chaotically back and forth, move around stacks of papers and backpacks, and never actually took anything new with him. He didn't even grab the cigarettes. The vibe was off and I wanted to leave, so I didn't bother saying anything. We got back into his truck after that and he offers to roll up a blunt. I said yes. So we smoked and sat in his car at a random street in the Bronx. He had been giving me small compliments all night, but I didn't think anything of it. I knew this guy was kinda creepy, but I could use it all to my advantage to get what I wanted. But he started talking more deeply about how beautiful I was, and then directly after this tells me he has a daughter my age, and I kinda look like her. Which, gross? I was kinda concerned at this point, but didn't really know how to end this interaction, as I was sitting in his car on a random street in a potentially unsafe area. Mind you, I was in my freshman year and only 2 months in, so I was not familiar with this area. After he finished smoking, he offers to take us to a deli for some cigarettes. Finally, and a breakfast sandwich. How could I refuse? He goes in and gets us 2 bacon, egg and cheese, and a pack of Marlboro Reds 100s for me. He gave me the sandwich, and then asked if I wanted to keep hanging out with him, but he made it clear that I didn't have to, and that it was okay, and he would drop me back off at campus. I said I wanted to go home. He takes me back, which is only about 3 minutes away from the deli we went to. I said thank you for the cigarettes and sandwich, but before I got out of the car, Carl tells me he wants to see me on Valentine's Day. I said, maybe. And he became adamant I hang out with him on Valentine's Day, so I eventually say yes and get out of the car. I got home around 5 a.m. The whole interaction only lasted about 2 hours, so there was no lapse or me forgetting periods of time. Thank God my friends were still somewhere on campus to retrieve me. I told them everything, and they were so mad that I would do all that alone, which was fair, and thought it was weird as hell that I would pick up scrap metal with him. It was. A few months later, I get a text message. I gave him my number. Really stupid. It's a picture of a very young lady, probably around my age at the time, a clean and handsome Hispanic man, while the man I was with was a 65-year-old scraggly black man. He sent the picture along with, "Hey, do you remember me?" I obviously blocked the number, and nothing ever happened again. Was this just some random, slightly creepy, and lonely man who just wanted something similar to a girlfriend experience for the night? Or something way scarier? I was thinking maybe he was gonna try to make me go back to his house and try something sexual, but then realized there was a bunch of people home, so he couldn't and just backed out, smoked a blunt and dropped me off. Who knows, but it was definitely super creepy, and regardless of his intentions, I think I came out of the situation very lucky. A good lesson for kids about stranger danger. This was 4 years ago. I was 15 and I love puzzles. I wanted to buy one but didn't have much money, so I went out with my sister, who was 12 at the time, and short for her age, looking for random toy stores that sold off-brand and cheap toys. We found one in an area of town that didn't have much activity around. It didn't really look like a toy store in the front, and when you walked in you could see the shelves full, and it looked like they haven't been rearranged in years. It kind of seemed like the store didn't really have a reason to be there. There was a man at the cash register who noticed us coming in. I didn't really get a weird vibe from him or the store. It was just empty. So we look around and there's no puzzles. So I go up to the man and ask him, "Hey, I can't seem to find any puzzles. Do you know if there are any that I'm missing?" The man answered, "Oh, yeah, there's puzzles. They're downstairs." I didn't see any downstairs when we entered the store, but I was like, sure, show me the puzzles. This was like the 3rd store we had tried, so I just wanted to find my toy, you guys. The man walked around the counter into this door that you wouldn't notice unless it was pointed at. He opened it and it revealed a steep staircase going down. At the bottom was a plain wall. You have to go left or right to enter whatever the room was. It didn't seem like there was toys down there. It was also kind of dark down there. There really wasn't downstairs to the store. Wouldn't the door be open? At that moment, I got that stomach drop feeling and the get the fuck out of there, man feeling. The man was looking at me, waiting for my sister and I to walk down in front of him. I was like, oh, my mom is calling me. I'll be right back. My sister and I got the heck out of there, and I've never even been close to that store since. Maybe there were puzzles down there, maybe there weren't, but I was definitely not going to stay and find out. Also, it's very important to be careful in that sort of situation, because if I was right and the man did have bad intentions, then if I had taken just one more step closer to the stairs, he could have pushed me down the stairs, and at that moment, there would have definitely been no possible escape. So don't ever go down random stairs, y'all. Stay safe. This happened years ago when I was barely 14. My middle school, and my best friend's middle school at the time, organized a trip abroad to Great Britain, London to be exact. It's supposed to be a few days looking at London attractions, museums, and shops. It was fun until it wasn't. On the day before we were supposed to leave and go home, we were brought to the streets with some interesting shops, and we received free time for shopping. Then our teachers and guide had a brilliant idea. They told us after the time for the shopping ends, we have to meet on a different street than this. In retrospect, it was only 100 meters away, but they still should not do that. Most of us have never been to London, and we barely speak English. We don't have a map of the city. Roaming services didn't work correctly. 90% of the students got lost. I got lost with my best friend because we went in the complete opposite direction. We were both confused about the directions we were given. We were both walking along pavement. My friend was running ahead or staying behind to nervously look around. We didn't look like we were together because we were not interacting with each other. I guess this is why this happened. My friend ran ahead and stopped to look around. I saw a black car approach me and match my speed. I started to feel like this was a scene from a movie. It was broad daylight, there were a lot of people around, and no one reacted. I was confused and didn't know what was happening. Then from the car stepped a man and said, "You are nice, come with me." And then he tried to grab me. The car was still running, so I suppose someone was still in it. I was stunned. I did not believe it was real. At that moment, my friend ran to me from behind, grabbed me, and dragged me away. We ran and tried to lose them if the man or car followed us. After some time, we stopped, and my friend nervously cried, shaking me and screaming, "Why didn't you move when the man tried to grab you?" I explained my deer in headlights moment. We cooled down and managed to ask some people for some help, and we were found by our teachers. We didn't tell anyone about what happened. We were sure no one would believe us. After that, when we got back, I told my parents, and I never went on another trip organized by my school. My mom considered all of that really unprofessional and irresponsible. This happened to me a few weeks ago in New York City. I'm a female, 23. I was walking to an appointment in Midtown. It was morning. I had my headphones in. This older woman was walking towards me and started urgently waving me down as I passed her. I slowed down to take out the earbud because I'm curious. She immediately starts telling me how her friend was supposed to meet her right there and wanted me to call him because she doesn't have a phone. Then she's like, "It'll just be a second. His number is," and starts rattling off his number. I don't know why, but I found myself starting to actually type out his number to call when everything clicked. I don't want this random guy she's calling to have my number. My gut said it was a bad idea, and also, I'm gonna be late to my appointment. I was just like, "Actually, sorry, I gotta run. Try using the phone in one of those stores." She flips a switch, starts yelling at me, tells me to fuck myself, etc. I put my earbud back in and then hauled my ass away from her. When I was a bit further from her, I looked back and she wasn't stopping anyone else. Anyway, you think this was some kind of scam? Drug related? Just a crazy person? Or something more sinister? It was pretty freaky either way, especially the way her demeanor changed. I have lived in New York City all my life, but this ranks as one of my oddest encounters. I probably owe my life to someone I met only briefly. It was about 30 years ago, and I was coming out of my dentist, who was located on a desolate side street between Penn Station and 7th Avenue, not far from Macy Herald Square. At about 6:30 p.m., my dental work finished and the sun just started to set. I walked out of the appointment only to run into a man who repeatedly, intentionally slammed into my body while pretending it was an accident. I had formed an intention of saying nothing, but to slowly edge my way closer and closer to open the door of a chock full of nuts and make a quick dash for the entrance. Again and again the man said, "Excuse me, miss," and slammed into me from the street side. As I tried to pick my way across the sidewalk to the open door, he must have stepped back and hit me 6 or 7 times. When out of nowhere, a large man stepped forward and said, "Miss, where are you going?" Terrified that they were going to tag team me, I said, "I'm trying to make my way on the 6th Avenue subway entrance at Macy's." This mysterious guy grabbed me and propelled me so quickly the couple blocks to the subway that my feet didn't touch the ground. Even though I'm a young woman of a larger size, the mysterious man took me right to the train, then disappeared. My dad said he was probably a plainclothes cop. I never found out who he was or what the other guy was trying to pull, but I'll always be grateful for having been saved from something quite potentially bad. These are all very short, so I decided to compile them into one post. One time I was walking in Grand Central with my boyfriend. We were headed to a concert for New Year's. I noticed a guy, clearly homeless and inebriated. My boyfriend wanted to walk past him, but I had a bad feeling, but he pushed me along. The next thing I know, a hand is gripping my arm, and I scream bloody murder. Around 10 cops appear within seconds, some in full military gear. They surround me and the guy who grabbed me. They promptly arrest him, explained he has been arrested 45 times for similar things and lives in the station. I got a free MTA ticket and had to write out a police report. Another time, I was walking on my street, which is in a pretty safe neighborhood. All of a sudden, I hear a man yelling on top of his lungs, and I see a tall man hurling towards me, arms flailing, either on drugs or mentally ill. He's coming right at me. There is scaffolding all around me, so there's nowhere for me to go. I decide to duck under the metal bars and sprint across the street. I look back to see him still running down the sidewalk. A few minutes later, I heard a bunch of sirens, but don't know what happened with that man. Another time, many years ago, I was minding my own business on the subway. This woman and man came on at one stop, and the man was clearly on some drugs, with the woman looking like she was practically chaperoning him. He swung around on the subway pole, singled me out, and said, "It's my birthday," over and over again. The woman apologized for his behavior, and I shrugged it off. A few stops later, both the man and the woman get off, but they turn around as the door was closing, and both simultaneously beckoned me forward, saying, come with us," as the door closed. It was so incredibly bizarre, and I have no idea why they wanted me to come with them. I'm a 19-year-old female. Today, I have just been getting creepy vibes after a day at the beach. My family and I were going to the beach for some raffle tickets, but also some fun. But it was starting to rain pretty hard, and I went straight into our car to just chill for a few hours, till the rain stops. But my parents stayed. They're still raffling, not giving a damn about the rain. A few hours passed by and it did stop. I went out to go walk on the sand instead of swimming because I didn't have any extra clothes. But some old man called out for me. I went over to him and he was asking where I lived, and stupidly, I told him. He tries to get closer to my ear and whisper, "You want to go to a walk with me sometime? Just us alone?" I felt something cold after he said that, like I was shivering. Immediately I said no thank you, and before I left, his smile suddenly turned upside down, and he looked very angry that I rejected him. After we went home, I went straight up and locked the doors in the house, since my parents left again to a party, and it was just me and my little brother in the house. I was watching TV in the living room while my boyfriend was sleeping, when I hear him yelping like a hurt animal. I figured he was asleep and having a bad dream, because this isn't the first time he's done that, but I still didn't know how best to approach him. I met his eyes when I walked into the room, first blinking slowly, then wide. I tried to talk to him in a calm, level voice, explaining that he was asleep and having a night terror. He was moving his mouth like he was trying to talk to me. He kept pointing behind me, which eventually creeped me out, and I looked and I had to turn around. I reassured him nothing was there, but I'm still so creeped out. I thought when people have night terrors, they couldn't move, but he was able to change his facial expressions, mouth words, and use his arms somewhat. Anyway, now my PS4 is acting up. It keeps pausing and rewinding my show, and the whole thing is making me want to burn sage. So I like to say that maybe on average once a month, I get a really strange feeling that everything around me is fake or staged. It's pretty difficult to describe. It's almost like I'm on a movie set or something, but not quite. I've been getting this feeling since at least middle school. I'm now in my mid-30s. It's kind of similar to that feeling you get when you experience deja vu, except without that feeling of re-experiencing something, if that makes any sense. It's more of a sensory thing than anything else, like how the lights hit certain things, or the ambient sounds or feeling of the air. Everything just seems off. It can be extremely unsettling at times, but usually doesn't bother me at all. At first, it used to really freak me out, but now I just write it off as my mind playing tricks on me and don't actually think anything strange is going on. It usually happens at night or early AM, before sunrise, but occasionally happens during the day too. It mostly happens when I'm outside, but it does sometimes happen when I'm inside. It usually happens for a short amount of time, like a minute to an hour max. Does anyone get this feeling too? Anyone know why I'm getting this weird feeling? Am I crazy or what? It doesn't really affect my life in any real way, just kind of throws me off for the day when it does happen.
Many years ago, my girlfriend, Maya, and I spent our spring break on a road trip to St. Louis, Missouri from New Mexico. We wanted to see the Gateway Arch and check out some other sites nearby. She also had grandparents that lived in the area, and they welcomed us to stay with them while we were there. This gave us a bit more wiggle room in our budget and helped us greatly. We planned on leaving super early to get a head start on traffic and taking turns driving and sleeping so that we could save more time and money on hotels, which did work out in our favor. Well, for the most part. Most of the drive went smoothly. We had printed out our drive and directions and even planned our stops. And yes, I said printed directions. This should tell you how long ago this was. We ate, made our planned stops with minimal detours or extra stopping, and slept all according to plan. What we didn't account for, though, were the Midwestern storms. We had stopped at a gas station in eastern Kansas to fuel up, and it had then started raining. No big deal. We had a fully functional car, so the wiper blades worked just fine. We got back on the road and continued on, knowing that we only had about 4, maybe 5 hours left of our drive. But it hadn't even been an hour later when the rain began pouring. I've lived in New Mexico all my life. Now, I'd seen some rainstorms and some pretty bad ones, but I had never experienced anything like this. So, yeah, I'm not afraid to say that I got a little nervous. Maya, however, wasn't as concerned and just offered to drive if I wasn't comfortable. Seeing her calm demeanor did help calm me down some, and I continued on. Unfortunately, the rain would not let up, and it became louder as it hit my car. That's when we realized it wasn't just rain, it was also now hail. I have never seen hail so big in my life, and still haven't since. It became so loud and heavy that I thought it was going to smash my windshield. I couldn't really hold back my fears, so Maya suggested that we pull over so that she could drive. This time, I agreed. We pulled into a gas station and I went in asking to use their phone. Maya didn't have a phone and I just had a prepaid one that I was trying to save the time on in case of emergencies. I called my parents and let them know where we were. I then explained how bad the weather was, and my mom sounded worried and suggested that we take shelter at a hotel until it passed. Of course, this didn't really help relieve any of my concerns, but I told them I would consider it and ended the call. I went back to Maya, and after sharing with her, she said that she would continue the drive, saying that we would probably be fine. I tried my best to remain calm and just trust her judgment. We continued to drive, but it seemed like we were honestly going further into the storm. The rain and hail continued, and the wind was so strong. I thought it might even blow us off the road. And speaking of the road, I could barely see the lines on it, let alone a few feet in front of us. We were on a pretty empty stretch of road with no exits nearby, but I looked over at Maya to ask if we should maybe just pull over and wait it out. And her face told me all that I needed to know. She no longer looked so confident. I pleaded with her to pull over, and she agreed. We were now on the shoulder and parked, and we sat there in the dark and silence just trying to decide the best thing to do. I grabbed my phone from her purse to at least call her grandparents, or my parents, with an update, and of course I didn't have any signal. It was a bit disconcerting to see, but I told myself that we were parked, so we should be okay. We tried keeping each other calm by just talking and occupying ourselves, which did start to work. We probably sat there for about 45 minutes when we noticed that the hail had stopped. It was still raining pretty hard, but since the hail cleared up, we could see the road a bit better and decided to give it another go. But as it goes, there's always something. Now, the car wasn't moving. It started just fine, but it appeared to be stuck. We got out and checked, and sure enough, the tires on the passenger side had sunk into the mud. This road didn't have any sort of barriers on the side, so it just went from road to grass and dirt. I tried pushing it while Maya steered, but it was not budging. Then, when we finally got some movement, it began sliding more into the shoulder, almost like it was fishtailing. Sorry, I'm not good with cars at all, and I'm not sure how to better describe it. At this point, there was no way we were going to be able to get the car out alone. We got back in the car, now soaked, and grabbed our beach towels from our bags. Cue the worried feeling again. Now we were definitely stuck in this storm, in seemingly the middle of nowhere, late at night, and we had no real options. I still didn't have a signal on my phone, and neither of us had any other ideas. I just really hoped that we weren't going to start hearing the tornado sirens. We just grabbed some snacks from our food bag and tried to wait it out and hoped for the best. Honestly, this whole thing took a lot out of us. Not to mention the whole drive prior, so we both started getting pretty drowsy. As we were laying back, trying to relax and just stay calm, we saw lights coming from the opposite direction towards us. To our surprise, they actually slowed down, stopping next to us, and they rolled down their window. It was an older man in a pickup, and he said probably the best thing I had heard that night. "Y'all need some help?" We probably should have been a little hesitant at first, for the reasons mentioned above. Middle of nowhere, stranger, dark road, etc., but we were so desperate that we decided to take the risk. The man got out of his truck, put some kind of board between my back bumper and his front, and pushed my car while Maya steered it. It came out like it was nothing, and the man's truck plowed right through the mud, too. By the end of it, we were all completely exhausted, soaked and freezing, but finally, with the man's help, we managed to get our car back on the road. He even followed us to the next exit, which had a McDonald's, to make sure that we made it out okay. We were incredibly grateful to that man. He could have kept on driving, he could have been a creep, and we would have had nowhere to go. But instead, he stopped, and he helped two dumb girls stuck in a ditch. We tried to pay him as a thank you, but he refused and said that he was just happy to help. We went in and used their phone to call my parents and her grandparents to give them an update, and then decided to sleep in our car in the parking lot for a few hours, hoping that by the time it was lighter out, the rain would have dissipated. Thankfully, it did, and we made it to her grandparents' place with no other issues. Overall, it ended up being a great trip, but I told Maya that I would never again drive anywhere with her in the rain. Only partially joking. But it was also nice to see that there are still good people out there that are willing to lend a hand. I like to believe that I'm a fairly careful person and that I do a pretty good job keeping myself out of trouble and away from dangerous situations. That said, as much as I've done a good job at keeping myself safe, I have one thing that happened to me that was genuinely terrifying. And while I wasn't personally hurt, it still messed with my head. It was one of those moments that you never think you'll end up in the middle of, and afterwards, it just kind of sticks with you and creeps up into your mind while you're lying in bed at night. The day that this happened, it was in the middle of summer. I had literally just turned 18 a couple days prior, and had spent a couple of days at my friend's house in a nearby town. I was actually driving home in the mid-afternoon. I think it was around 3 p.m. or so. I had the windows down and the wind blowing through the car because of how nice it was, and was just jamming out to some summer pop song, enjoying the drive. As I was driving down a quiet and slightly rural road, I noticed that there was a young woman down the way with her thumb outstretched, which I honestly didn't know was a thing people did. I thought that the whole thumb thing out on the road was a movie cliche, but there she was. And she looked to be in her early 20s, long, dark hair, and a simple and quite cute sundress. Though I was always warned about the dangers of picking up strangers, something about her seemed harmless. She almost looked like my little sister, just older. So I guess part of me saw some familiarity in her and immediately thought, if my sister was out on the road like this, I would want someone to stop for her to see if she was okay. I decided to stop and see if she just needed a quick ride down the road, or if she needed to go a long distance. She told me that she was needing a ride to a specific gas station about 10 miles up the road. It was in the direction that I was going, and I would have passed by it anyways, so I told her to hop in and said that I could get her there. At first, the conversation was incredibly casual and friendly. She told me her name, I told her mine. We chatted about the weather and how absolutely gorgeous it was that day. She made a comment about the song that was playing on the radio. I don't remember what song it was, but it was some top 40 song, and she was nodding along to it, singing quietly. She even told me a bit about who she was, how she was a bit of a vagabond, and she was doing an experiment to see how far she could go on the kindness of others. This was before van living was a thing, so it was a bit of a foreign concept to me, and I was shocked that it was working out the way that it was for her. After a bit of chatting and friendly back and forth, she started talking about how much she liked to listen to true crime podcasts and such. It started with her saying that, being out and alone like this, she listened to them to be aware of the horrible things that could happen. But Then she started talking more and more about various murders, cold cases, and such, to the point that I could tell that she was a bit obsessed. I don't mind true crime stuff. It's not my favorite, but I was willing to hear her out because she was very clearly passionate about them. However, it shifted from her talking about the podcasts to her talking about very specific cases in very, very vivid detail. The way that she got excited when she talked about the people dying, it made me feel a bit uneasy, to say the least. She then turned to me and literally asked, "What do you think it feels like to die?" If she had just made the comment, it would have been one thing. But she said it, turned to me, and just stared at me like she really wanted an answer. I sort of just stammered and mumbled that I didn't know, and that I guessed it would just be painful. She laughed and commented that it would probably be the best feeling you could ever have, because, in her words, it would be the final explosion at the end of all the build-up and hype. Then, it got worse. She turned back to me and said, "I wish that I could find out what it felt like without actually dying." And she seriously smiled at me, like she was expecting me to volunteer to help her. I just sort of said, "Huh, yeah," and tried to keep going without making eye contact, thinking that maybe she would get how creepy she was being. But she followed that up with, "If I asked you to help me, would you?" I was pretty obviously taken aback, and I told her that I would not be able to help her and said sorry, and that I just kind of wanted to focus on driving. She fell back into her seat and said, "Well, alright," before just turning to focus back onto the road ahead of us. And this made the whole situation feel super awkward and heavy. Like, how do you come back from that kind of comment? Well, her idea of coming back from the comment was to literally throw the door open and jump out of the car while I was going 50 down the road. She opened the door, undid her seatbelt, and just jumped out onto the road while I was going full speed. I slammed my brakes and screamed as she jumped, the whole situation playing out in a horrible series of chaotic seconds. I threw the car in park, grabbed my cell phone, and then ran over to check on her. She was pretty messed up, but was definitely still breathing. I called 911 and told them about what happened. They sent an ambulance and a few police officers, as this was definitely a suspicious situation. For some reason, the memory of them lifting her onto the stretcher to get her into the ambulance is seared into my brain. Just seeing them trying to lift her gently so as to not further her injuries. I could tell that she had broken a few things, though, and it was not pretty. I had to explain to the police that she wasn't a friend, and how I had just picked her up and was giving her a ride. They looked at me like I was crazy. Part of me thinks they were debating whether or not they were thinking I shoved her out of the car. I explained what she said right before she jumped, and after a while I think they got the idea. And maybe they realized, with how distraught that I was, that it wasn't my doing. They did call me back a few days later and asked me to come in to give an official statement, and I was actually informed that they were treating this as an attempted suicide, and that they were needing my statements to help get her into a mental health hold. I gave them what they asked for, and that was the end of it. I have absolutely no idea what happened to this girl, and I'm terrified to think that she may not be with us anymore. She was such a sweet young lady when we started talking, but she switched over to the crazed person in literally a second. I do hope that they were able to get her the help that she needed, and that she was able to continue on her trip to wherever she was going. But this event really instilled a strong lesson in me about not judging a book by its cover. Back when I was a kid, there was a group of us kids that pretty much spent every day of our childhood together. For the most part, it was myself, Chuck, and Billy. The three of us were like brothers. We did everything together, camped in each other's backyards, spent way too many hours of our days off together. Billy ended up moving away sophomore year, but beyond that, we literally grew up together. From elementary school, all the way through the year where we all graduated. And Billy actually came back home so we could all have a party when he and Chuck finally finished high school. My point is, we were inseparable best friends, and we're all still in touch with each other. Now, while the three of us were obviously really close, there was a fourth person in our group for a little while, and that was a little girl named Katie. Katie had lived on our block for a few years before we met, and the whole time that I knew her, it was just her and her dad that lived at the house. He was a single parent. None of us had actually met her mother. Katie was my age, so a year older than the other two, and she was nothing short of a bit strange. Though we did end up figuring out why when all was said and done, and nowadays I actually feel bad for how we treated her for being weird. I met Katie when I was around 8. She was, to the best of my knowledge, the only girl in the neighborhood that was in our age range. So when we met, it was pretty obvious that she was going to latch on to our trio. We were 8 and 9-year-old boys, so we were a bit annoyed that there was going to be a girl with us, since we were still at that age where girls were a foreign concept. At first, Katie was fine with the three of us, though. She was interested in some of the things that we were, and she was willing to play our dumb games. We would sword fight with our toy swords, and she was willing to jump in and take a few hits. And she could actually hold her own. She was interested in animals, so she was willing to help me dig up my yard to look for bugs. Basically, she was one of us for the most part, except when she wasn't herself. Katie was fine probably 95% of the time, but then, sometimes, she would just be a bit out there. Like she was a completely different person. Those times where she would be different, she would sometimes get violent, angry, or just really, really strange. I know that that's vague, and I'm not going to get into all of the instances where things were wrong, but I'll describe at least one of them. The first event of note was one day while we were at Chuck's taking turns playing the Super Nintendo. And this was typically something we did once a week. We weren't allowed to stay cooped up in the house every day, so it was always super exciting for all of us. I think we were playing one of the Mario games. I'm not sure which one, and it was Katie's turn. Katie wasn't great at that game, but she usually took her losses with grace and laughed about it each time she messed up. Not this time. This time, she was playing and she misjudged a jump and ended up dying. Obviously, when this happened, we all chuckled as we did when one of us made a mistake and died, but she didn't. She had a flat stare as she stood up, and by the time the game took us back to the level select screen, Katie had literally jumped up and stomped down on the Nintendo. She smashed it with all of her body weight, and while the console was mostly okay, they actually built those things with this possibility in mind, something I learned later in life, the game ended up bending and snapping in half. Obviously, we all freaked out, and Chuck started bawling. The Super Nintendo was his pride and joy. Katie then looked over at Chuck and put her hands around his throat, literally choking him, and she was telling him to stop crying, that he needed to grow up, that he wasn't a baby, and if he wanted to cry, she would give him something to cry about. Billy and I jumped into action and pulled her away from Chuck, leaving this whole situation a confusing disaster, and Chuck just sitting there looking terrified. Chuck's dad came in to figure out what had happened, and we had to explain to him what Katie had done. Strangely enough, Katie actually agreed with our statements, and she was willing to own what happened. She said that she was angry, that she wanted to destroy it, so she did. She said that Chuck was crying over nothing and that he needed to grow up. I honestly don't know what really happened after that, because Chuck's dad told us to go home. But I do know that Katie's dad bought him a new game, and Katie wasn't really allowed at Chuck's house anymore after that happened. In fact, I don't think Chuck and Katie really spent any time together after this, and for good reason. I don't really want to get into all the events that Katie caused, because this story would go on for ages, but I do want to go over one of the last things that ended up happening. The thing that I think may have caused Katie to be odd. This was around a year after the whole thing with Chuck happened. I was on my own that day and went out into the woods that were behind our neighborhood. I was out there, pretending that I was some kind of adventurer when who else would I see but Katie? I went over to talk to her, but as I approached, I noticed something a bit weird. Katie was sitting on the ground, her back against a tree, and she was eating a sandwich while talking to no one in particular. I walked up to her to ask her who she was talking to, and when she noticed me, she jumped and screamed that I should not be there. I was obviously taken aback and a bit scared, and I asked her what I had done wrong. She then started going on about how I was upsetting her mother, how she was having dinner with her and I wasn't invited. I kind of just looked around and mentioned that she was alone, that her mom wasn't there. She flipped out. She started screaming at me aggressively that her mother lived in the woods, that I wasn't allowed to be anywhere near her mother, and that I needed to go home before she hurt me. Again, I was confused, but I just said that I was sorry and that I didn't know. Strangely enough, Katie shifted from psychotic and ready to pounce to almost sympathetic. She said it was okay, that if I was really sorry that she wouldn't be mad at me anymore and that I was welcome to sit with them. I hesitantly agreed with her, mostly because I will admit that at this time in our relationship, I did have a crush on her. So sitting with her was something I was more than willing to do. Yes, I had a crush on Katie, in spite of her random, strange behavior. I sat at one of the trees and just watched her eat her sandwich and talk. She was talking about school, about all the things that she was going through, what she was going to be doing that week. She wasn't talking to me, though. It was like she was just talking to no one in particular, like she was basically telling her mother about her life. I was a bit curious, so I waited for an opening and then asked her where her mother was. This is where things turned to haunting. Katie looked at me and started crying, like full-on sobbing. I kind of freaked out. I didn't mean to make her cry, so I scooted over to her and I gave her a hug and asked her what was wrong. Katie then pulled away and told me that her mother lived in the woods because one night she and her father got into an argument and her dad hurt her. I will say that at this time we were 10, so this was a whole new thing to me. My parents were always happily married, so I didn't understand the concept of my dad hurt my mom. That idea was impossible to me. I asked how he hurt her, why he hurt her, and so forth. Basically interrogating this poor crying girl. She stopped crying, pushed away from me, and then told me something that makes my blood run cold to this day. She looked me in the eyes and said, "My mom's not really living out here. She's dead. My dad killed her. He killed her and buried her out here in the woods. I saw him do it. He doesn't know that I saw it, though. He doesn't know that I know what he did. He doesn't know that I watched him choke her until she died. He doesn't know that I watched him dig this hole, that I watched him bury her. I watched him do it." She kind of started just rambling all of this and shifting between crying and not crying and looking back. She was clearly traumatized. I honestly think that this is what caused her to be so strange and aggressive. She saw this horrifying event and didn't know how to process it. Of course, I told my parents what she said. Being my age, I didn't know what else to do. But I told them what she said to me. Of course, my parents called the cops, and they reported what Katie had said, and all of it was this huge mess. The cops ended up doing an investigation, talking with Katie about everything, taking reports from her and her father, asking me about everything, and then they did the excavation. This is where things went from weird to just absolutely devastating. They dug up the spot in the woods, and they actually did find the body of a woman. Katie wasn't lying or making any of it up. Her dad actually had killed her mother, and he actually did bury her in the woods, which tells me that she really did watch all of this happen. To wrap this up, Katie ended up leaving town to live with someone else in her family. Her father was arrested, and all of this was my fault because she trusted me and I told my parents. Obviously, I did the right thing. Her mother deserved justice, and looking back at it as an adult, not telling anyone would have been the worst thing to do. That said, I will never let go of the fact that I changed a huge portion of this girl's life. She was a bit weird, but she was my friend, and I did like her. And because I told my parents what she told me, her whole life changed direction. And I never saw her again. That day where she told me about what happened was the last time we actually ever spoke. I never got to say goodbye or anything. I do hope that her life went back to normal after this, or as normal as it could be. I hope that she found peace because she deserved it. And I hope that someday she and I can talk again, so I can tell her that I'm sorry for all that she went through. Katie, if you ever read or hear this story, please know that I've never forgotten you, and I mention your name every single time that I pray.